what happened to Dawn of War 3. It came out last year with quite a lot of hype behind it. It was the next entry in one of the last great RTS series out there, made by a veteran developer. And then it came out and, I don't know, it's not like there was this massive negative backlash or anything, but it fell by the wayside after about a week. A truly terrible game would have a list of complaints a mile long, but getting to the bottom of what caused Dawn of War 3 to fail without playing it is really tricky. That's because making a good sequel is even harder. On one hand, you've got to give people what they like, but you've also got to iterate and change. A good sequel can be defined in these two ways. It needs to iterate upon the previous game, offering a different viewpoint or improving the experience, and it needs to, well, you know, still be good. In order for a sequel to be a progression or an improvement on the previous entry, it needs to carry over some of the same ideas that are present in both entries. This is what I'm going to call the core. The bit of the game that's so integral to the experience that without it, it wouldn't be the same game anymore. Despite any number of iterations to the rules, the story, the graphics and stuff, the core of the gameplay experience still remains. What's the core of Dark Souls? Is it the story? Well, no, I'm pretty sure no one except VatiVidya actually cares about that. What about the gloomy neo-gothic aesthetic? Not really. The combat system? Well, it certainly supports the core experience, but I think the core of Dark Souls is the challenge. The tough but fair gauntlet of boss fights and the smaller, equally tough enemies that lead up to them. Each of the games in the Souls series is very different, but there's no denying the presence of this unifying core. Dark Souls 1 created the foundation, but the bosses were a bit hit and miss in places and the game was severely lacking in polish. 2 iterated on this by tightening up the controls, adding some quality of life changes, and making sweeping balance adjustments like nerfing Estus flasks so they couldn't be used to avoid damage outright, and made some tweaks to how stats worked in order to make more weapon types and playstyles viable. Dark Souls 3 was another interpretation of the original game, with faster paced, more aggressive combat and a renewed focus on even meatier boss fights. Despite personal preferences between them, it's clear to see that the core went unchanged, even when the series branched out into stuff like Bloodborne. So, answer me this. What's the core of Dawn of War? I can't work it out. Each of the 3 games operate differently. It's really hard to find a shared mechanical foundation upon which the series rests, beyond the fact that they're all real-time strategy games in the 40k universe. These games are different to Dark Souls because, for whatever reason, they kinda throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over with every successive iteration. This is the reason why there's such a wide gulf between fans of Dawn of War 1 and Dawn of War 2. Most either prefer one game or the other, because each game has a very different core. To understand what people love so much about the previous 2 games, let's go back in time 10 or so years to play Dawn of War 1. The footage you're seeing here is from Dark Crusade. It's not the most recent expansion, but it's pretty much universally agreed to be the best one, namely because it doesn't have the overpowered factions and rubbish air units introduced in Soulstorm, the final expansion. Dawn of War 1 is a macro RTS in every sense of the word. It's all about fighting big battles with big armies, with a focus on acquiring territory and coordinating large groups of units, rather than effective use of abilities and tight positioning. Though of course those things are still pretty important. People love this game because it was all about macro play and high level decision making, while still maintaining the viscerality and campiness of the tabletop game. Dawn of War 1 is very much a traditional RTS, but it separates itself from the likes of Starcraft and Command & Conquer by focusing on spectacle and a much slower, deliberate pace to combat. Jump forward 5 years and contrast that with Dawn of War 2, which ditched base building and big armies in exchange for a small group of squads led by a powerful hero unit. While they might look cosmetically similar, there's a lot that's been chopped and changed since Dawn of War 1. Artillery, ultimate units and static emplacements have been ditched in favour of much more micro-intensive units such as heavy weapons teams, which require setting up prior to a fight, also a revamped, much more important cover system, and heroes taking centre stage on the battlefield. This leads to a game that focuses much more on small, action-packed skirmishes where every unit counts and tactics is king. rather than management and planning ability. These games are completely different and cater to very different kinds of players. Players who like Dawn of War 1 for macro strategy and titanic battles will find a pared down, more fiddly game waiting for them in Dawn of War 2. Conversely, those who like the sequel will play Dawn of War 1 and say that it's shallow, snowballing and drawn out. The core of these two experiences just isn't the same. This is most easily seen in the single player modes for each game. Dawn of War 1 has a huge battle map where you control one faction of 7 and have to coordinate a war to take over this planet by moving your army around. It's pretty neat, the whole thing plays out like a tabletop game. It's a great way of shaking up what's essentially a series of skirmishes by adding some cool alternate mission setups, like this one where you've got a massive fixed army and have to take down a mega base, or these missions that involve you sieging an enemy fortress. The world map adds another layer of macro strategy on top of a game that's already about build orders and army composition by giving you an overarching goal to deal with. Dawn of War 2 single player, on the other hand, it's like if someone made Diablo into an RTS. No, I'm dead serious. You control a party of 4 heroes and it's your job to chew through legions of dumb goons by using abilities and picking the right gear. There's quite a lot of depth to the combat actually, from what gear to pick to setting up cover and firing arcs to fighting real honest to god bosses in an RTS. The Dawn of War 2 campaign is absolutely nuts, but it's also tactics at its most raw and intimate, stripping away base building, making units and tech trees in favour of a game where every little move counts and you actually get attached to your little Space Marine goons. While these games might be poorly constructed as a series, it's kind of okay because they're both great games by their own merits. The issues start when you don't actually know what people want in your games because you've got no idea what the core of your series actually is. That's what frustrates me about the whole Dawn of War 3 sucked because they tried to make it into a MOBA argument. That's a symptom of the problem, not the cause. The list of mechanics from MOBAs that Dawn of War 3 has that 2 doesn't is actually pretty slim. They've both got bases defended by turrets, hero units, farming, etc. The difference between them comes in Relic missing what people actually liked about the first 2 games. On the surface, Dawn of War 3 is actually quite sleek. The game is responsive, the UI is nice, the graphics are great, and it seems to be trying to strike a middle ground between its 2 predecessors. On one hand, proper base building is back, so are listening posts, and so are most of the old units from Dawn of War 1. On the other, dedicated hero units are still about, though even more powerful this time around, so are heavy weapons teams and also a few targeted abilities from Dawn of War 2. But from the first mission of the campaign, I could tell something was off when I forgot what units I had and what they could do. See, in both of the other Dawn of Wars, units were distinctive and had a variety of functions, even on the most basic of levels. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the humble Space Marine tactical team. In Dawn of War 1, you had a bunch of modular upgrades with which to customise the squad. Sergeants that boost morale, targetable grenades, and multiple copies of 4 different alternate weapons, from flamethrowers to missile launchers, all on a single faction's basic ranged unit. Dawn of War 2's tactical marines have 3 mutually exclusive weapon upgrade choices, an optional sergeant, and 2 activatable abilities. One that increases damage against armoured units, and one on a long cooldown that makes them temporarily immune to suppression. Despite being examples of 2 very different design philosophies, each version of the tactical squad gives players a buttload of choices. So what about Dawn of War 3? They, they can shoot guns. Alright, in fairness, they have a choice between a flamer, which gives them a simple point-and-click ability, or plasma guns, which increase damage, but make them have to cool off after a while. Which, in itself, is a feature nicked wholesale from the Eldar's basic ranged unit, whose single active ability is to throw a grenade. Wait, hang on a sec. The Orc's basic ranged unit also only has one ability, and each of the factions is roughly the same, but Space Marines have better vehicles and some artillery units, Orcs have cheap units and a numbers advantage, and then Eldar have expensive, powerful units with shields. Oh no. No. They've gone and done it. The madmen. They just made Starcraft! Alright, I'm kinda joking here. But it's pretty undeniable that a lot of the tactical nuance that would have been in Dawn of War 3 was sacrificed on the altar of the Chaos God esports. That's the really frustrating thing about the game. There's the shell of a great title here, if only it had been designed with a semblance of integrity and a unified vision. Instead, it stretches itself too thin, trying to pander to a new audience, all the while trying to appeal to both camps of returning players, under the mistaken idea that they'll be satisfied by token implementations of ideas that should have stayed in the older versions. Cover is technically in the game, but it's been reduced to these weird little fortified locations that have even less mechanical depth than garrisonable buildings. Dawn of War 1's big stompy units are back, but they're now relegated to being so-called elite units, and they completely dominate the battlefield rather than being counterable by smaller units. Some units have setup times like heavy teams in Dawn of War 2 used to, but without firing arcs and proper suppression they may as well be turrets. Hero units too have the same problems as the rest of the game. Despite having a choice between more than 10, they all feel so shallow and homogeneous. For the most part, they've usually got one or two of the following: a jump/charge, an anti-infantry AoE, or a buff/debuff. And that's about it. There's no interesting tactical decisions here. You just use their abilities on cooldown and they completely dominate the battlefield. Their only real competition is either another hero unit or an elite unit. When making Dawn of War 3, Relic tried to strike a middle ground between Dawn of War 1 and 2 to appeal to both sides. But they clearly didn't know what the enjoyable core experience of these two games actually was. Dawn of War 3 has neither the rich network of macro level decisions of Dawn of War 1, nor the moment to moment slugfestiness of Dawn of War 2. It's this horrible generic mess of a game, and that is its real crime. Dawn of War 3 is a testament to cynical mediocrity, and it deserved to get treated as such. Developers make this mistake all the time, and the best example I can think of is Resident Evil. Capcom have this horrible habit of making a great game and then slowly going off the rails as they forget what made the original popular, and then wising up and going back to their roots, only to repeat the same mistakes. Resident Evil 1 was a great horror experience, and then 2 and 3 made some mechanical strides, but they controlled like trying to do heart surgery with a chainsaw, and were trying way too hard to take themselves seriously. Resident Evil 4 was a soft reboot on the series and allowed Capcom to lean into the campy territory they'd been failing to avoid up until now, while modernising the classic formula of ammo conservation and tense survival horror. With the silliness turned up to 11, the game was free to really commit to being an homage to pulpy horror movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with stuff like the crazy Spanish cultists, the giants, and of course the chainsaw guy. Unfortunately, it also led to Resident Evil 5 and 6, which abandoned the core elements of the series to gradually transform it into a series of dumb action movies with increasingly loose interpretations of survival horror, which of course meant the series had to be rebooted yet again into Resident Evil 7, a game modelled after more modern scare 'em ups, but with the Resident Evil formula restored once again. Resi 7 retains the pulpy campness of 4, but doesn't lose sight of what made the great games in this series fun. Tense combat, memorable, if slightly silly characters, and the difficult decisions you've got to make to survive and conserve your resources. They even managed to make the story unironically good. I think Resident Evil's director, Masachika Kawata, says it best in this interview with, wow, Forbes? Really? Okay. He says, "We drew influence from the series' survival horror roots, and Resi 7 actually has a lot in common with the first Resident Evil game. We wanted Resident Evil 7 to embody the core of what a Resident Evil experience is, elements of fear and horror, plus the ability to overcome them. Now if that's not the core of Resident Evil, I don't know what is." Despite a change from fixed camera carpal tunnel simulator, to third person shooter, to first person shooter, Resident Evil as we know it has survived the transition. Unfortunately, the same just can't be said for Dawn of War, because Relic doesn't know what Dawn of War actually is. The core of Dawn of War is probably a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But whatever it is, I think we can all agree, it sure as hell isn't this.